Hey artist, welcome back to my channel. For our next project, we will prioritize experimentation and the design process while creating sculptures in cardboard. Cardboard is a simple but versatile material. We've seen it used in commercial products like the Nintendo Labo, where it can be used to make pianos, vehicles, and more. You may also have noticed that Amazon often recommends simple crafts on its shipping boxes. We will be scaling up or scaling down a common household object to create a detailed cardboard sculpture. When deciding on the subject of your sculpture, the incredible work of pop artist Claes Oldenburg will serve as their main point of inspiration. Oldenburg's public installations typically feature large replicas of everyday objects, transforming the ordinary into extraordinary. You will be given 2 weeks for this project to allow for appropriate ideation of your work, as you'll need to take precise measurements of your chosen object and plan how to proportionately scale up a small object or even scale down a large object in your home. This time frame also provides an opportunity to gather materials. The most important material for this assignment is cardboard. I highly recommend that you guys find 2-ply cardboard, as it's easy to work with, is rigid, and can stand up to us working with it for our project. And it's also really great for scoring, which we'll talk about in a little bit. In order to make your marks and measure out your work, you will need a ruler. Additionally, you're going to need pencil and paper in which to plan your project. If you don't have a sketchbook, just regular paper, any paper will be totally fine. For cutting our cardboard, you guys can use an assortment of items. I personally like these straight edge cutters. This can be found at the Home Depot or Lowe's. Chances are your parents already have one of these handy that they can help you with. You can also use just an X-Acto blade, understanding that we definitely want to leave the cap on when not in use. If none of those are in your home, if you've got a really good pair of scissors, that should do the trick. For binding your work, you're going to need a rather strong adhesive. For my example, you're going to see me using an Old Faithful hot glue gun and hot glue sticks as filler. If you don't have a hot glue gun of any size, you can of course use craft glue, super glue, Gorilla Glue, etc. And feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions about substitutions. An optional but really encouraged material is sandpaper. An assortment of sizes is great. A fine size like 400 is really wonderful for just going ahead and cleaning up edges and rounding corners on your cardboard. The last thing that I will note is in this example, I'm going to be using a mat. You definitely don't want to be cutting cardboard directly on a table or flat surface. You can use additional cardboard as a mat for cutting, or you can work with your family to see what can happen to make sure that your furniture and home stays protected. For my example, I've chosen to scale up the much beloved Nintendo Switch. I love the classic and pretty sleek design. I also appreciate the challenge that these curved edges will present while creating. When you're getting started with this project and moving through the ask and imagine phase of your design planning, I want you to actually move to a sketchbook or a piece of paper to just see what the different components are. My idea is to work and recreate a Nintendo Switch. So you notice that I break it down. It's got 3 parts, 2 Joy-Cons and the center console. Within those 3 parts, I'm not only trying to draw it to go ahead and recognize the depth and the dimension that it contains, but also I'm trying to break down the measurements for each and every one of those parts. I would highly recommend that you work through this, going through as many details as possible, even including some of the ornamentation, so that later when you're creating, you don't forget about adding these details. I highly suggest that you start your details with the main foundational pieces. You'll notice how I've broken these down into length, width, and height. Please don't forget about the different sides of your work. So for instance, the front Joy-Con looks completely different than what the back of the Joy-Con looks like. It looks totally different from what the side of the Joy-Con looks like. Being able to capture these different elements from different perspectives will help you immensely when you start to build your piece. As your materials allow for, I'm going to encourage you to scale up, being careful while taking measurements to go ahead and account for these materials in your new project. I've decided to double the size of the original object. You'll notice how I'm working with these 3 different dimensions, length, height, and width, in order to scale up appropriately and proportionately. I'm also writing notes to myself. Like for instance, this says I'll need 2 pieces for the front and the back. When working with cardboard, there are a few simple and foundational techniques to be aware of. In order to check where your grain is located, you can just very lightly bend your cardboard and you'll be able to see where that grain runs. So this is telling me where to cut. I suggest that you cut along the grain as much as possible in order to make nice even lines, and also so that your edges from the cardboard cuts are nice and neat as well. So for example, if I were to take my cutter and run along the grain, it's a much simpler cut than if I pick up this edge. You can see that I don't have any texture, okay? It's just a nice clean line. Whereas if I were to cut against the grains, it's going to be a little bit harder, but it still works. And in the edge, you can see all of that texture running through it. If you're thinking, oh, but how are we going to utilize this with our Joy-Con? That's where this first technique comes into play. Because we want this strip to not harshly line up with the edge, but to actually mold around it. So on the back, what you see I've done is create lines in order to score. And my lines are about 1/2 inch. And I like using 1/2 inch score lines because I think they're pretty easy to work with. Looking at my Joy-Con, I've got these really nice curves that I want to be able to wrap that width around. When you are scoring, you're not trying to cut all the way through like I did to create the border. Instead, I'm just trying to cut through this very first layer of cardboard. And that way, it can still look refined on the outside. So, again, I'm watching my fingers, I'm coming in, and I'm adding just the lightest pressure. I'm going over my score lines, and I'm being really careful just to go through that first top. Every once in a while I check to make sure I haven't gone through. Again, you'll get the hang of it. Just be patient with yourself. You can always practice on a spare piece if you'd like to. Once I've gone all the way through, I'm able to start bending. You can see from the inside that that's quite visible. Because I've marked my 1/2 inch score lines, they're all consistent, which means from the outside I get this really nice consistent bend, okay? And then from there you can see how I can position this inside, and I can wrap around the structure itself. When we look at the back of it, I see this complex curve happening here. And so I already know that I'm going to need a little bit more flexibility than what is established from simple scoring on the side. I'm going to create those same 1/2 inch, or if you want a little bit more flexibility, you can do 1/4 inch pieces. I'm going to make some lines. And I'm trying to think about where that curve is happening and for how far does it extend. And then once I've got those lines, I'm going to simply go the other way. Get some 1/4 inch pieces started this way. I find that this works really great for those organic lines that happen in shapes. Again, I'm remembering, just like with my simple scoring, that I'm only trying to cut through the top layer of cardboard. I want the bottom layer to remain intact. I'm holding it from far away so as to keep my fingers safe. When I'm finished, I'm going to come over here and do the same thing. So I'm essentially making a checkerboard on the top layer of my cardboard. So once I have it finished, I'm going to retract my blade for safety, and I'm going to start to mold and bend. This is where we need a light touch and patience. Once you have the core pieces or foundational pieces of your object constructed, you can move on to the decorative details. You want to have your notebook nearby so that you can check where your measurements are and where they need to go in order to create proportionate scaling. So right now you can see that I'm working on these Joy-Con details. I'm still using the same 2-ply cardboard that I was using for the foundational pieces. Because these are really detailed cuts, it's always helpful to save them towards the end so you've had a lot of practice making those nice precise cuts. You can still use a little sandpaper to smooth out the edges like I've done here, but really you just need to take your time. I cannot wait to see the fantastic works you create from cardboard and look forward to seeing your progress soon. Stay safe, stay creative, see you soon.